Hello, everyone, and welcome to my virtual student research presentation for the 2019-2020 academic year. My name is Hannah Pohl, and I am a senior at Truman State University and a history major. And today my research is done through the mentorship of Dr. Sally West and her research genealogy and family history course. So kind of looking at my topic, we are looking at the resiliency of the Polish Catholic identity of Belarusian immigrants. So what my thesis is kind of stating is that due to both the culmination of the Russian and Polish influences, it created this political dichotomy within the Belarusian identity. And that because of these two cultures, it was absorbed into the Belarusian ethnicity, creating like this dichotomy, and how it was hard for Belarusians to just kind of have one identity, and they kind of pick and chose throughout this time frame. So kind of before I go into the history and the research of my ancestors, it's pretty important that I give you some pre-ancestral history of Belarus and why my ancestors immigrated to St. Louis and the historical importance of everything. So kind of looking at this time frame, we are looking at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was from 1386 until the partitions of Poland starting in 1772. And this is important because we're starting to see the multi-ethnic and multi-religious union of Poland and Lithuania. And right here where my cursor is, we see this little dot called Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, which is the territory that we're going to be focusing on for most of this presentation when we're looking at Eastern Europe. So kind of going into our next graph, we are seeing the partitions of Poland, which is where when the Polish Commonwealth started to break up, these partitions were absorbed into different empires. The specific one that we'll be focusing on is the Russian Empire. Because yet again, we'll see right here where my cursor is, that Minsk was absorbed into the Russian Empire, and that started to create the beginning of some of this political dichotomy, because the Commonwealths that had been part of Poland for so long and the Poland Commonwealth started to have these religious ties, these cultural ties, and then were being forced into another empire with a different religion and different religious ties and different cultural ties and even different linguistic ties. And it was very hard to see how Russification was being pushed upon these partitions, specifically like Minsk and other partitions of Poland, kind of forcing this Russian agenda that we will kind of see due to Alexander III. So kind of continuing, yet again, we see Minsk right here, which is very close to Poland in this graph, and we see the whole area of the Russian Empire. And we also see the other surrounding areas that were once part of the Polish Commonwealth that are now a part of this Russian Empire. So focusing on my family, and the whole basis of this paper is because it was a genealogy course, we had to pick a family branch. So I decided to pick my paternal side, which is my father's side, and my grandmother's mother's parents, so my great-grandparents, and specifically how their lives worked, both when they were in Eastern Europe and when they were in the US, and the historical connections between them. So we'll be looking at Sam Zidane, who was born April 13th in 1893 in Minsk, Belarus, which, like I had shown you guys in the graph earlier, which is the capital of Belarus. And he was raised Orthodox. And that's very important because he eventually actually converted to Polish Catholic, which is very unique. So because Zofia Zidane was born April 8th, 1891, and her maiden name is right down here is very Polish. She was actually born in Poland until the age of 8, where she was born and raised, when her mother actually placed her in a Polish orphanage in Minsk, where she was raised Catholic. So here we kind of see a picture of my family, my ancestors, to kind of like add to the research that I had to kind of go through. So then we kind of start to see and understand what happened and why their identity kind of pushed them to St. Louis and why they immigrated in the first place. And it was because of this conflicts of both the Polish and Russian identity and nationalism. Because Belarus was not separated from both Russian and Polish categorizations and historical document, it made it very hard for these Belarusian individuals to feel like they had an identity. It was very common due to the subcategorization of Belarusians and Ukrainians to be considered Russian on historical documents, in the census, and other official documents because they were part of the Russian Empire. And unfortunately, because many of them were categorized as Russian, their faith was categorized also as Orthodox, even though, as I kind of saw from my research, a lot of Belarusians actually identified as, this Polish Catholic identity, including my ancestors. And we kind of see this because under Alexander III, we kind of see this push of Russification, which included the push of like Orthodoxy nationalism. So this like common Russian ideal. But yet we kind of like are starting to see that that wasn't really the case. And it really wouldn't be a history paper unless I kind of saw if other historians agreed with me. And I kind of saw that they did. So I kind of focused on two historians that saw that there was this lack of one identity for Belarusian immigrants. The first being Barbara, and she kind of mentioned that Belarusian immigrants, or just immigrants in general, could kind of pick and choose their nationalities. And she gives the story of the three brothers from Belarus. One brother decided that he was going to go with the Polish Catholic identity due to his mother. The second brother actually went with the Belarusian identity, which was very unique because Belarusian nationality didn't start way after World War II. And then the third brother, due to him working in the factories, which was not very common for Belarusians because they were more agricultural based, he started to follow more of a Russian identity. So we kind of see them pick and choosing their identities. And historian Pierre Anders also kind of says that there's really only two identities that individuals can pick from at the time. It was either Russian or Polish, and it was due to their religion. They either were Orthodox, which meant that they followed the Russian identity, or they were Catholic and they followed the Polish identity. So here we kind of start to see why there was a lot of religious oppression, because there was this push of Russification. It was kind of pushing away this Polish Catholicism, and really they wanted to integrate Russian Orthodoxy. And a huge primary source that I focus on is the play called Locals, which is based off a Belarusian family speaking about what it means to be Belarusian. And they discuss these two scientists that are from Minsk, like I said, that's the capital, and they're both described in very stereotypical ways for the time period. One is Russian Orthodox, the other one's Polish Catholic, and they're both stereotyped in the way that they speak and that they dress and their mannerisms and their kind of like cultural behavior. And this kind of further goes to describe like the conflict of cultural and political identity that these Belarusian immigrants were having. So then we kind of see, well, there's a lot of oppression happening in Belarus. So why did my family move to St. Louis, especially when there's a lot of other Polish and Russian communities? So Sam and Sophia immigrated to St. Louis in 1913. And Anton Sedan sponsored their trip, which was very common for immigrants. This is typically how they came over. And they came over, one of the factors we believe why they came over is because St. Louis was such a large city for the immigration population. They also had a huge predominant Polish community. Ironically enough, my ancestors lived less than a block away from St. Stanislaus Parish, which is a predominantly Polish Catholic church. And historian Helen Lapata described this as the local neighborhood theory, where this means that individuals who have similar identities and have similar religious ties and like oppression stories tend to group together. And we'll see that in the next graph. So here we kind of see the beginning of what green cards start to look like, and we also see the changing in the last name, which becomes important later on in kind of like my thesis of this identity. But here in this graph, in that huge red circle, is the Polish community that my family moved to, and also was the Polish community in St. Louis during this time frame. They had immigrated, like I said, in 1913, and this is a graph from around 1914. So this is a huge, predominantly Polish community right there in that circle, which is where that huge parish was, St. Stanislaus, and where my ancestors had lived, kind of continuing to show that my ancestors had kind of like started to identify as this Polish Catholic identity. Here in the graph, we kind of see a photo of actually where my ancestors had lived during that time frame, and this is a current day picture of St. Stanislaus. Due to time frames, I won't be able to show you exactly how short of a walk it was from their house to the church, but it was less than 10 minutes. So that really shows you the like tight-knit group that these individuals had. And also we start to see that a lot of Russian Poles started to try to find jobs due to unskilled labors. Unfortunately, a lot of immigrants, regardless of their occupations in their home country, were not given similar respect when they came to the United States. So unskilled labor was a huge industry for these Russian Poles, one of them being the brown shoe factory in St. Louis, which Sam Zedan worked at up until his death. So it kind of shows that the continuation of these Russian Poles and their identity and where they started to cluster. Unfortunately, we also then start to see the struggles of assimilation. We saw the oppression that they had due to their religion and under the Russian Empire, but we also start to see that here in St. Louis as well, and why they continue to stick to that Polish identity and that Polish community. So historian Erwin T. Sanders explains it as the inferiority complex. And unfortunately, it's because the Russian Poles were facing oppression through what we consider Polish Jews, which is still something we actually see today. And due to like this Polish stereotype of them being unintellectual and like unable to assimilate properly, they were denied clerical positions, higher education positions, and many other jobs outside of the unskilled labor, which is why so many of them had to cluster in the unskilled labor groups. So this led to very unfavorable self-images and alienation. And also due to this, they started to change their last names and pronunciations to fit that Anglo-Saxon linguistic environment, which you can see with my ancestors. You see it from where they went to Zedan with the H to without the H on the end, and it changes the pronunciation of their last name. Ironically enough, my great-great-grandmother kept her very Polish-sounding name, Zofia. Yet we saw through a lot of historical documents that they still try to Americanize it with Sophia or Sophie, yet due to the connection that she had with her Polish identity, she refused to change it, and she wanted to hold on to that even though they changed their last name due to the struggles of assimilation. Unfortunately, the assimilation wasn't the only hardship that my ancestors had found, not only the oppression from their home country and the oppression they had found in St. Louis, but also the relationship hardships that they had. Unfortunately, Sam and Sophia had a son named Nick, who had died at the age of 5 from pneumonia in 1927. And based on the testimonies of Sam and Sophia's children, Stanley and Mary, Sam and Sophia didn't handle the death very well. After this, Sam actually became a raging alcoholic, and Sophia began to rarely talk. And unfortunately, on May 23rd, 1949, Sam Zedan hung himself in the closet of the family basement where their oldest son, Walter, found them. And 14 years after that, the day after the 39th anniversary of Nick's death, Sophia ended her life in the same method and location of Sam, where Mary Podleski, the daughter of Sam and Sophia, found them. But thankfully, Mary was actually able to get a waiver from the Catholic Church so that her parents could be buried near Catholic cemetery. Because unfortunately, the Catholic Church has specific beliefs on suicide. They weren't able to actually be buried in the Catholic cemetery, but thankfully they were able to be buried near it, still showing those strong ties that they had to the Polish Catholic community. So, and here, kind of wrapping things up, I just wanted to show a picture. So here in this picture, there's actually, right here is Sophia herself, and this is actually my grandmother, and then her sister, Gloria. So this is my grandfather, Barb, her sister, Gloria, their brother, Jim, and then this is Walter Zedan, one of the sons of Sam and Sophia, and his wife. And what this picture kind of presents is that my family continued to like hold on to their very strong Catholic identity. Mary Podleski actually ended up marrying a Polish immigrant herself. So changing her last name from Zedan to Podleski, kind of continuing the strong ties of the Polish Catholic identity. And even still today, my family has very strong ties in the Polish Catholic Church. And we kind of see that regardless of this oppression and the hardships of assimilation that they kind of saw through the historical backing and even in their lives in St. Louis, that this identity that as Belarusians they had remained true after they immigrated and after years to come. I thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. It was a lot of fun and a lot of hard work. And I hope you enjoyed.